Winter, 1944. A cold wind cuts across a French hillside slick with frozen mud. German tank crews peer through binoculars, certain no machine could climb that slope alive. Then faintly, they hear it. Deep mechanical growls echoing from below. American Shermans, mud-caked and determined, begin their impossible ascent. What happened next would redefine armored warfare. This is the story of the hill the Germans said no tank could take. Subscribe for more untold WWII moments. By late autumn of 1944, the Western Front had turned into a maze of mud, steel, and exhaustion. After breaking through Normandy and liberating much of France, the U.S. Army's armored divisions pushed relentlessly eastward toward Germany's heartland. The victories of summer had faded into the gray fatigue of a bitter winter campaign. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel convoys crawled across shattered roads. Yet, the American advance continued, methodical, unstoppable, and full of quiet confidence. The German Wehrmacht, though battered and retreating, was far from finished. Their defense now relied on the geography itself. Commanders marked every ridge, forest, and hill as a fortress in waiting. Among these was a steep, seemingly unassailable slope near a small French village whose name barely survived the war maps. To the Germans, it was a natural barrier, a wall of slick clay and jagged stone rising above a narrow valley. They called it der unmögliche Hang, the impossible hill. It was the kind of terrain that offered every advantage to the defender. Tanks bogged down at the base would become easy targets. Infantry would be forced to crawl under open sky. German spotters, stationed in camouflaged bunkers along the crest, could see everything that moved. Machine guns covered the approaches. Anti-tank guns were zeroed in, their barrels waiting for the next column to dare the slope. The American 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, had encountered dozens of such positions before. Each time they learned, adapted, and advanced. Yet, this hill presented something new, an angle so sharp that even experienced Sherman crews doubted it could be scaled by their tanks. Engineers studied contour maps. Officers debated whether it was worth the risk. But intelligence reports suggested that bypassing it would give the Germans time to regroup and dig in farther east. The order came down: take the hill. The Sherman tank was never meant to be a mountain climber. Its design prioritized mobility and numbers over armor thickness or gun power. To German crews manning Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman was derisively called a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit up every time it was hit. But that nickname ignored what truly made the Sherman deadly: reliability, coordination, and the willpower of its crews. By 1944, American tactics had evolved from raw courage to calculated precision. They no longer fought just to match German armor. They fought to outthink it. The hill before them symbolized that shift. The Germans believed physics was on their side. The Americans believed ingenuity would make the difference. For days, reconnaissance units watched the slope, measuring gradients and soil density. Combat engineers began laying out a plan not of brute force, but of timing, traction, and teamwork. Artillery would soften the ridge. Infantry would sweep the flanks. Then, the tanks, if they could, would climb. On the other side, German panzer crews waited in confidence. Inside their armored beasts, the heavy, angular shapes of Panthers, they felt secure, even superior. Each tank crew had fought across Europe and believed that the American advance would break itself on nature's own wall. To them, the idea of a Sherman clawing its way up that muddy slope was absurd, almost laughable. Their commanders instructed them to conserve ammunition. Let them try. They won't make it halfway. What they didn't know was that the Americans had learned from every failure since Tunisia. They understood how to turn terrain into opportunity. They'd modified engines, adjusted tracks, and mastered coordination between tanks, bulldozers, and infantry. The battlefield wasn't just fought in guns and shells, it was fought in problem-solving. As the winter light faded behind the gray hills of eastern France, American mechanics tuned engines in the cold. Men tightened treads, scraped mud from bogie wheels, and studied the slope through field binoculars. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog and snow, the German line waited. No one expected what would happen next. Not the generals, not the crews, not even the enemy whose confidence would soon be shattered. Tomorrow, they would attempt what the Germans called impossible. And when those engines roared to life at dawn, the world would learn how far American determination could climb. The challenge was not only the hill, it was the mindset that stood behind it. The Americans understood that wars weren't won by brute force alone, but by adaptation. Every campaign had taught them that lesson the hard way. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen crossroads of Bastogne, the U.S. Army had been forced to learn faster than the enemy. By the winter of 1944, those lessons were written into every bolt, every tread, and every maneuver the Sherman tank performed. When the first M4 Shermans rolled into combat in 1942, few believed they would remain relevant by 1944. German armor outgunned and out-armored them at nearly every turn. A Panther could kill a Sherman at twice the range. A Tiger's frontal plate was almost impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun. Yet, on the battlefield, the Shermans kept advancing. What they lacked in thickness, they made up for in numbers, reliability, and coordination. Where one tank faltered, 3 more filled the gap. They could be repaired quickly, fueled easily, and transported across bridges that would collapse under a Tiger's weight. That logistical mastery became America's hidden weapon. The hill that now stood before the 4th Armored Division wasn't just a slope. It was a test of doctrine. The Germans viewed terrain as static, an obstacle to hold or defend. The Americans viewed it as fluid, something to adapt to, manipulate, and overcome. Engineers with slide rules and grease pencils gathered around maps in a tent lit by kerosene lamps, sketching gradients and marking potential ascent paths. Their conclusion was bold. If they lightened the tanks, adjusted track pressure, and used a staggered climb formation, the Shermans might just make it. Mechanics got to work immediately. Extra gear and ammunition were stripped to reduce weight. Tracks were widened slightly with field modifications to gain better traction in mud. The crews poured sand over the treads to prevent ice buildup during the night freeze. The men didn't talk much as they worked. They didn't need to. Every soldier knew what was coming. Every wrench turned was a quiet vote of confidence that they could make the impossible climb. At the command post, Colonel Creighton Abrams, one of Patton's most trusted tank commanders, studied the hill through binoculars. He had led tanks through the chaos of France and understood both the limits and the genius of the Sherman. His voice was calm, but absolute. "We're going over." Abrams knew the Germans had positioned anti-tank guns along the upper ridge, relying on the assumption that no armor would ever reach them directly. That assumption would be their undoing. In the days leading up to the assault, American artillery blanketed the valley. Precision strikes cut German communication lines. Infantry patrols crept through the woods at night, planting white markers along paths the tanks would follow. These weren't just tanks rolling forward. It was an entire synchronized machine of men, steel, and strategy working as one. Still, doubts lingered. Tank crews gathered around small fires the night before the operation, faces lit by the faint orange glow. Some stared silently at the looming darkness of the hill. Others tried to joke, but the sound didn't travel far. Most were veterans. They'd seen how a tank could vanish in a burst of fire and smoke within seconds. Yet, there was something different about this moment. Something defiant. The Germans had mocked them for months, calling their machines inferior. Tomorrow, they would show that determination and innovation outweighed arrogance and steel. The weather turned against them that night. Freezing rain coated the valley in a thin layer of ice. It was the kind of condition that halted most operations. But when the order came down at dawn, "Advance," no one hesitated. The roar of the Sherman engines broke through the morning silence, rolling like thunder through the valley. Men climbed into their tanks, gloves stiff from cold, hearts steady. Each driver knew the risk. If they stalled halfway up, the tanks behind them could not maneuver to help. If one slipped, it could block the entire ascent. But the plan depended on trust in their machines, their comrades, and the belief that the American spirit could climb any wall the enemy built. The Germans watched through rangefinders, still laughing in disbelief. The Americans were about to prove that the impossible hill wasn't a wall at all, just another road waiting to be climbed. War often comes down to men facing moments that defy reason. For the crews of the Sherman tanks at the foot of that frozen French hill, this was one of those moments. Inside each tank, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and cold steel. The engines rumbled beneath their boots, shaking the floor plates as though reminding them of the power caged inside. Some crews taped photographs of wives or children to the turret wall. Others muttered quiet prayers. The only light came from the faint glow of dials and the ghostly reflection of dawn through the periscope slits. It wasn't fear that filled them, it was focus. Every man had a job. Every motion was practiced. The tank commanders scanned through binoculars, charting where the slope began to rise sharply. The gunner adjusted elevation controls, anticipating the first German silhouette that might appear. The loader waited with shells stacked neatly beside him, armor-piercing, high-explosive smoke, each one marked with grease pencil for fast recognition. The driver, hunched forward, felt the vibration of the tracks like a pulse. These were ordinary men asked to do something extraordinary: drive a 33-ton machine up a mud-slick hill while being shot at by a hidden enemy. The infantrymen walking alongside shared the same quiet determination. Their boots sank into the cold sludge, rifles held tight, eyes watching for muzzle flashes from the ridge above. They had learned to read the land as soldiers do. Every depression in the soil could be shelter, every fallen tree a trap. In their faces was the kind of resolve that comes from months of fighting, from seeing what happens when you hesitate. Tactically, the plan was daring. The tanks would climb in a staggered V formation, each covering the other's blind spots. Engineers had marked the safest routes with white cloth strips driven into the mud overnight. Artillery would fire a rolling barrage, each volley landing just ahead of the tanks as they advanced, to suppress German positions. It was a choreography of timing and precision, executed under the worst possible conditions. Overhead, the weather was low and gray. No air cover could reach them. The ground was their only ally now. At the command post below, radio operators maintained constant communication, tracking every tank's movement on a greaseboard map. Calls came in, brief and tense. "White 1 moving. Green 2 advancing. Minor slip, continuing." Every inch gained was reported, logged, and relayed. The sound of engines echoed up the valley like a single heartbeat. For the Germans on the ridge, it began as amusement. Through their optics, they saw the Shermans start their climb, slow, almost hesitant. The slope looked impossible even to walk, let alone drive. They assumed the Americans would get stuck halfway and retreat under fire. But as minutes passed, that confidence began to waver. The tanks didn't stop. Their treads churned, spinning mud high into the air, gripping, grinding, pulling upward inch by inch. Below, the tank crews fought physics with every ounce of skill they had. Drivers kept their RPMs steady, avoiding the instinct to push too hard. Gunners held their aim even as the hull pitched and rolled beneath them. The loaders sweated in the confined space, shoving shells into breeches slick with condensation. The commander shouted corrections, his voice barely audible over the mechanical roar. It was teamwork in its purest form. Trust forged under pressure. German machine guns opened fire, the rounds sparking against tank hulls and kicking up dirt around the infantry. American gunners answered instantly. White smoke shells burst across the ridge, blinding the defenders long enough for the Shermans to press higher. One tank threw a tread. Its track snapped like a whip, but the others adjusted formation to shield it. The hill had become a moving battlefield, every meter contested, every movement a test of nerve. What kept them climbing wasn't just orders. It was pride. Each crew knew that this operation wasn't just about a hill, it was about proving something to themselves and to their enemy. The Germans had built their reputation on technological superiority. The Americans were building theirs on adaptability, unity, and endurance. The mud didn't care who had thicker armor. It only rewarded those who refused to stop. By mid-morning, the tanks had reached the halfway point, something no one on either side had believed possible. Their hulls were coated in mud so thick it dulled the shine of their steel. The engines screamed in protest, and yet they climbed. From the ridge above, the German observers lowered their binoculars in disbelief. For the first time, they realized that the hill they thought impassable might soon fall. Not because the Americans had stronger tanks, but because they had stronger will. And as the Shermans kept advancing, their tracks digging deeper into the earth, it became clear the impossible was only the beginning. The success of that climb did not rest on courage alone. It was engineered, tested, and refined long before the first tank touched the hillside. Behind every Sherman that growled toward the ridge stood an invisible army of mechanics, engineers, and tacticians who had spent years shaping the machine into the weapon it had become. When the M4 Sherman was first introduced, few could have predicted it would serve as the backbone of the Allied armored forces. Compared to German Panthers or Tigers, it seemed almost modest. Thinner armor, a smaller gun, a lighter frame. But it was this very simplicity that became its strength. The Sherman could be built faster, repaired quicker, and modified in the field by crews who barely had more than wrenches and welding torches. Its components were interchangeable across units. A damaged tank could be cannibalized to keep another fighting. The Sherman's suspension system, particularly the later horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, allowed it to traverse terrain that heavier German tanks could not. The broad tracks distributed its weight evenly, preventing it from sinking into soft mud or snow. On the impossible hill, this design was decisive. Where the Panther's narrow tracks might have slipped or bogged down, the Sherman's lower ground pressure and flexible suspension kept traction. Barely, but enough. American engineers had also mastered the art of field improvisation. Crews were trained not only to fight, but to fix. They knew how to tighten a track under fire, how to jury-rig a broken idler wheel, how to keep an engine running on fumes and prayer. It wasn't elegance, it was resilience. That night before the climb, several tanks were fitted with temporary traction aids, sandbags, welded cleats, and stripped weight for better balance. Nothing was factory standard anymore. Everything was adapted to that hill. At a higher level, strategy and technology worked hand in hand. Patton's Third Army had become a master class in logistical synchronization. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts moved in rhythm with combat units. Commanders at every level understood that momentum was their greatest weapon. If the Germans relied on fortifications, Patton relied on movement. Fast, relentless, unpredictable movement. The Shermans were not meant to match German armor gun for gun. They were meant to swarm it, outflank it, overwhelm it before the enemy could react. On the ridge that day, this doctrine unfolded perfectly. As the leading Shermans climbed, artillery batteries several miles behind adjusted fire by the minute. Spotters relayed coordinates through forward observers hidden in the tree line. The moment a German muzzle flash appeared, counter-battery shells were already in the air. Coordination like this had taken years to perfect, and it was one of America's defining battlefield advantages: communication. While German radio networks were often fragmented by fuel shortages or disrupted lines, American tank units operated under a seamless command net. Each platoon could communicate with artillery, infantry, engineers, and higher command simultaneously. Orders didn't have to travel up and down through bureaucracy. They flowed laterally, instantly. On a chaotic battlefield, that difference meant survival. The Germans had underestimated not just American courage, but American organization. Their panzers were technological marvels, complex, heavy, and temperamental. They required constant maintenance, specialized parts, and skilled crews. The Sherman was the opposite, rugged, forgiving, and built to endure mistakes. If a panther was a surgeon's scalpel, the Sherman was a hammer. And in war, the hammer often wins. Strategically, the operation symbolized a turning point in Allied warfare. No longer were American tanks merely supporting infantry. They were leading the charge, reshaping the battlefield in real time. Each Sherman on that slope was not just a machine, but a node in a living network of firepower, communication, and will. The German defenders could not see this network. From their positions, all they saw were individual tanks clawing their way upward. What they didn't realize was that every movement was coordinated, every risk calculated. Even when shells exploded near the lead tank, replacements rolled forward immediately, keeping the formation intact. To the observers on the ridge, it seemed impossible that such coordination could be maintained under fire. Yet, that was exactly what set the Americans apart. It was not luck or recklessness, it was precision born from planning, and faith in the system that held them together. As the Shermans neared the upper third of the slope, their guns elevated slightly, their engines pushing to their limits. The Germans scrambled to adjust. Their artillery, set to fire on fixed positions at the base, suddenly found the enemy halfway up the hill. Range calculations failed. Communication faltered. The very hill that was meant to protect them had become their trap. The Sherman's climb was not just a physical feat, it was a demonstration of technological philosophy. Build a machine that men can depend on, not worship. Every bolt, every gear, every modification that night had led to this moment, where ingenuity met determination head-on. And as the German observers struggled to believe what they were seeing, the American tanks pushed beyond the point where any tank had ever gone. The climb was nearly complete. The impossible hill was almost theirs. Dawn broke like a dull knife through the clouds. A gray light crept across the valley, touching the frozen mud, the bare trees, and the armored columns lined in silence. The American crews inside their Shermans felt the rumble of engines waiting for the signal, an uneasy rhythm beneath the stillness. Every tank was ready. Every man knew his role. The hill loomed ahead, steep and scarred, its upper slopes vanishing into mist. Then the order came. The first wave of Shermans lurched forward, treads grinding through wet earth. Their hulls heaved and dipped as they reached the base, engines straining against the incline. Exhaust poured into the cold air like smoke from 1,000 furnaces. Overhead, artillery thundered. Shells whistled past, slamming into the ridge and bursting in sprays of rock and dirt. The climb had begun. From above, German spotters shouted into radios. Through their scopes, they saw the tanks inching upward, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. They fired flares, calling in the first artillery correction. Within moments, the slope erupted in chaos. Explosions tore craters across the hillside, mud raining down like shrapnel. Yet the Shermans kept moving. Their tracks bit into the earth, their turrets turning, their guns barking back with short, precise bursts. Smoke rolled down the slope like fog from another world. Inside one tank, the crew could barely hear each other. The roar of the engine drowned every word. The gunner fired through the periscope slit, each recoil slamming through his chest. The loader's arms ached from shoving shell after shell into the hot barrel. The driver's hands were numb on the wheel, control levers guiding the tank up the incline 1 meter at a time. They didn't think about the top. They thought about the next few feet, the next heartbeat. German 88mm guns opened fire from hidden emplacements near the crest. The first round screamed down, striking the ground short of the lead tank, throwing up a column of mud and flame. The second found its mark. A Sherman shuddered as the shell punched through its side, bursting into orange fire. The crew scrambled out, rolling into the dirt as their tank burned behind them. Yet the formation held. The tanks behind shifted, left and right, filling the gap, their guns roaring in reply. For every machine that fell, another pushed forward. Observers later said the sound of that battle was like thunder crawling up a mountain. Midway through the ascent, the ground softened. The leading tank's treads slipped, churning the mud into a thick slurry. For a moment, it seemed doomed to slide backward, but the driver throttled down instead of up, letting the treads grip just enough to pull free. Inch by inch, they moved. Above them, infantry advanced in bursts, ducking behind rocks and shattered trees, firing at muzzle flashes they could barely see. The hillside had become a living, breathing thing. Smoke, steel, and mud blending into a single violent motion. For the Germans, disbelief turned to panic. Their firing lines were designed for enemies at the base, not crawling up to their gun pits. Spotters screamed coordinates into radios that no longer worked. Cables had been cut by American shells. The tanks, once small dots below, were now closing fast. Machine gun crews pivoted frantically, their weapons overheating from constant fire. One by one, those guns went silent. At the base, fresh Shermans joined the climb. Engineers followed close behind, clearing debris and towing damaged tanks out of the way. Supply jeeps, skirting the lower slopes, ferried ammunition and medical kits. The operation had become an unstoppable organism, every part feeding the other, every soldier driving toward the same impossible point. At 0900 hours, the lead tank reached the upper ridge line. The crew barely realized it. They were still fighting, still firing, but suddenly the ground leveled out. Through the gun sight, the gunner saw German figures running between bunkers, abandoning their positions. He squeezed the trigger once, twice. The shells struck home. The impossible had become real. Radio chatter exploded across the net. Lead. Unit on top. I say again. Sherman's on the ridge. Down below, the words were met with disbelief and cheers alike. Officers stared at the map tables as if expecting an error. But it was no mistake. Against all logic, American armor had climbed the hill. The tanks spread out along the crest, firing down into retreating German lines. Infantry poured upward, taking bunkers and silencing what remained of enemy resistance. The smell of gunpowder, oil, and wet earth filled the air. Smoke drifted over the ridge like a shroud, and somewhere among the chaos, the German tank crews who had mocked the idea of an American assault now faced the reality. Those same Shermans were rolling over the very ground they had sworn was untouchable. In the German command dugout, officers scrambled to withdraw. Their maps had no contingency for this. Their artillery, set for downward fire, couldn't depress enough to hit the crest. Their armor, positioned to counterattack in the valley, was now useless. What they had believed to be their strongest natural defense had become a liability. The psychological shock was instant and irreversible. The Americans, by contrast, didn't celebrate. Not yet. They were still fighting, still clearing pockets of resistance among the rocks and shell craters. But deep inside every man, there was a quiet realization. They had done something no one believed possible. The climb had not only broken the hill, it had broken the myth of German invincibility in terrain warfare. When the gunfire finally began to fade and the ridge fell silent, the battlefield was a ruin of mud and smoke. Wrecked Panthers smoldered near shattered gun pits. A few German soldiers emerged with hands raised, stunned more than defeated. The sky above the ridge cleared for the first time in days. From that vantage point, the Americans could see miles of liberated countryside stretching eastward, toward the next challenge, the next line, the next fight. But for a moment, standing there among the battered Shermans, the men allowed themselves to breathe. They had climbed what the enemy said no one could climb. And at that moment, they didn't just hold the hill. They owned history. The ridge was silent now, eerily so. The echoes of battle had faded into the wind, replaced by the soft hiss of cooling metal and the distant calls of medics searching for survivors. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage of burned-out tanks, drifting into a gray sky that seemed as tired as the men who stood beneath it. The Shermans, their armor scarred and mud-caked, sat like weary beasts at rest. For the first time in hours, their engines were quiet. Among the crews, there was no loud celebration, just quiet disbelief. Some leaned against their tanks, staring at the valley below, as though trying to understand what they had just done. Others shared cigarettes in silence, the flicker of flame briefly illuminating faces caked with grime. Every man bore the same look: shock, exhaustion, and a subtle pride that words couldn't capture. "Did we really make it?" one gunner asked, almost to himself. "Yeah," the driver replied after a pause. "We're on top of it, kid." The reality of that statement slowly sank in. They had climbed the impossible hill. Down below, medics worked tirelessly. Stretchers lined the slopes where the battle had raged hardest. Some tanks still burned quietly, black smoke curling upward in thin trails. The engineers cleared wreckage and filled shell craters, turning the blood-soaked slope into a passable route. For the first time, supply jeeps and ambulances began to crawl up the hill that hours before had been considered impassable. From the command tents at the base, radio messages crackled back to Division HQ. Objective secured. Ridge captured. When that report reached higher command, the room fell silent. Then came the disbelief. "That's impossible," one officer muttered. "They were never supposed to get up that hill." But they had, and the implications were enormous. On the German side, the shock was immediate and severe. In a bunker several miles away, Wehrmacht officers crowded around a field map littered with markers. Reports came in faster than they could be verified. Units overrun, gun positions destroyed, survivors retreating in chaos. One colonel slammed his fist on the table. "They brought tanks up there? Up there?" His voice broke somewhere between anger and awe. The staff officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what it meant. The hill was supposed to be the natural barrier, their strongest defensive point in that sector. The engineers had declared it too steep for armor, too exposed for infantry, yet the Americans had done it anyway, climbing through fire and mud to reach the top. The Germans hadn't just lost a position, they'd lost faith in their terrain and in their assumptions. Interrogations of captured German soldiers later revealed the same disbelief. One Panzer crewman, still in shock, told his captors, "We thought the slope itself would kill them. When the Shermans appeared above us, it was like seeing ghosts." The psychological blow was immense. German morale along the entire sector faltered. Units that had relied on natural defenses suddenly found themselves questioning every ridge, every forest line. "If the Americans can bring tanks up that hill," one officer was overheard saying, "then there is no safe ground left." Back on the American ridge, the tone was more subdued. The victory had come at a cost. Several tanks lay gutted, their turrets blown open. Dozens of infantrymen had fallen on the climb. Officers moved from group to group, checking on their men, offering quiet words of thanks. A chaplain made his way up the slope, his coat flapping in the wind, murmuring prayers over the dead where they lay. Near one wrecked Sherman, its gun still pointing toward the horizon, a lieutenant placed his helmet on the turret and whispered, "They said we couldn't, but you proved them wrong." Later that evening, when the sun dipped below the distant line of trees, the ridge took on a strange calm. The battlefield looked almost peaceful in the fading light, though the scars of war were everywhere. Smoldering craters, twisted metal, and the faint smell of cordite hanging in the air. Yet, beneath that destruction, there was something else. A sense that history had quietly shifted. Word of the impossible climb spread quickly. Correspondents in the field wired their reports back to London and Washington, describing how American armor had defied terrain and expectation alike. Newspapers would later call it the hill that shouldn't have been taken. For the soldiers who fought it, though, the headlines meant little. They remembered only the sound of grinding treads, the cries of men in the fog, and the moment the ground finally leveled out beneath them. They knew what it had taken to make history, and they knew how many wouldn't be there to see it celebrated. By nightfall, the engineers had cleared enough space for a forward command post. Radios were reconnected, maps redrawn. The ridge, once a symbol of German dominance, now served as the Americans' new artillery vantage point. From there, they could see miles of enemy territory. What had been the edge of the impossible was now a stepping stone to the next advance. In the German war diary, the entry for that day was brief and bitter. Enemy armor achieved breakthrough by means previously considered infeasible. That line would later become one of the understated summaries of a moment that had changed tactical warfare forever. The Germans had relied on nature to defend them. The Americans had relied on determination to conquer it. As night deepened, small fires dotted the ridge where crews gathered for warmth. Someone played a harmonica softly, its notes carrying faintly across the wind. Others sat in silence, staring at the valley they had climbed from. They had no grand speeches, no victory parades, just a shared understanding that they had accomplished something extraordinary. And somewhere in that quiet, between exhaustion and pride, one truth echoed in every man's mind. They hadn't just taken a hill. They had redefined what was possible. Dawn broke over the ridge the following morning, gray and soft, as if the sky itself was still unsure of what had happened there. The fog drifted low across the ground, wrapping around the Shermans like ghosts of the night before. Birds returned to the trees that had survived the shelling, their faint calls mingling with the distant rumble of American trucks climbing the newly conquered slope. The hill that once seemed unreachable now bore the marks of men who refused to accept limits. Deep ruts scarred the incline, like proof etched into the earth that human determination had clawed its way upward. Spent shells glinted faintly in the morning light. The flags on the tanks stirred in the cold wind. For the Americans, this wasn't just another victory on a map, it was a message, a demonstration of what grit, coordination, and courage could achieve against even the most daunting odds. The impossible hill had been conquered not by superior machines, but by the relentless will of the crews inside them. It was a triumph of adaptability, the very trait that had come to define the American soldier in the Second World War. As word spread through the ranks, officers across the front took note. Reports of the climb circulated among Allied commanders, who saw in it a blueprint for overcoming terrain and expectation alike. The Army engineers analyzed every inch of the slope afterward, measuring tread depth, soil compaction, and torque output. The conclusion was simple and humbling. By every logical standard, the Shermans should not have made it. But they had. That fact became a quiet lesson whispered in tactical briefings across Europe. Terrain no longer dictated possibility. Preparation and persistence did. The idea that a tank could climb where it shouldn't began to reshape battlefield thinking. American mechanized units started experimenting with new approaches. Angled ascents, synchronized thrusts, staggered formations, techniques born from that single, desperate climb. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, the reports arrived in neat folders marked "Confidential." Generals read the summaries and nodded grimly. The success didn't just signify another piece of land gained, it symbolized the American way of war. Find the edge, then push past it. Historians would later call it one of the most psychologically disproportionate victories of the war. The ground gained was small, the tactical advantage modest. But the impact, the message it carried to every front, was immense. German officers began reassessing terrain analysis, no longer trusting natural obstacles as unbreachable. That single event chipped away at the aura of invincibility that the Wehrmacht had built around its defenses. For the men who fought it, however, the legacy was personal. The hill stayed in their memories long after the war ended. In veterans' reunions years later, they would talk about the climb, not in terms of tactics or medals, but as a moment when they saw what men could do when no one believed they could. One tanker, decades later, would tell a journalist, "We weren't heroes. We just kept the throttle steady." But I think that hill taught us something about ourselves, about what it means to not stop. The journalist described his eyes, old, gray, steady, looking past the present, back into that foggy morning in France. That look, more than any medal or citation, told the real story. Time moved on. The war ended. The tanks were scrapped, the battlefields reclaimed by grass and silence. But in archives, military manuals, and memories, the hill remained, an example of what the human spirit could achieve when reason said no. At the base of that slope, decades later, a small memorial stone was placed. It bears no grand statue, no names of generals, just an inscription carved into the stone by a local craftsman. To those who climbed when the world said it could not be done. It stands alone, quiet, surrounded by the same wind and the same hills that witnessed the impossible that day. Travelers who pass it often stop, read the words, and imagine the sound of tank engines echoing through the mist. They don't hear the roar of battle, only the hum of perseverance. In that silence lies the true echo of the story. The climb was never about proving power. It was about proving resolve. It was about men who refused to surrender to the limits set before them, who treated impossibility not as a wall, but as a challenge waiting to be broken. And that, in essence, became the quiet heartbeat of the American war effort across Europe. An unyielding belief that no hill, no bunker, no line could stop those willing to keep climbing. The Shermans may have been outgunned, out-armored, and often underestimated, but they were driven by something stronger than steel, the determination of the men who believed in them. That faith, simple, stubborn, and unshakable, was what carried them upward that day, through the mud, through the smoke, into the pages of history. As the camera of memory pans back from that battered hill, we see it for what it truly was, not just a ridge of dirt and rock, but a monument to human endurance, the kind of place that reminds us that courage isn't measured in victory alone. It's measured in the will to move forward when everything says you can't. And in that timeless lesson of engines straining, of men climbing through the fog, of disbelief turning into awe, we find the legacy that outlived the war itself. Because long after the tanks rusted away and the flags came down, one truth still stands unshaken. The Americans climbed the hill the world thought impossible. And in doing so, they proved that there is no such thing as impossible.